United States from 1619 to 1865 inclusive. The task force documentation and examination shall include the facts related to the following: the capture and procurement of Africans, A. B. The transport of Africans to the United States and the colonies that became the United States for the purpose of enslavement, including their treatment during transport. C. The sale and acquisition of Africans as chattel property in interstate and intrastate commerce. D. The treatment of African slaves in the colonies and in the United States, including the deprivation of their freedom, exploitation of their labor, and destruction of their culture, language, religion, and families. E. The extensive denial of humanity, sexual abuse, and chattelization of persons. F. The federal and state laws that discriminated against formerly enslaved Africans and their descendants who were deemed United States citizens from 1868 to the present. G. The other forms of discrimination in the public and private sectors against free African slaves and their descendants who are deemed United States citizens from 1868 to the present, including redlining, educational funding, discrepancies, and predatory financial practices. The lingering negative effects of the institution of slavery and the matters described in this section on living African Americans who are descendants of persons enslaved in the United States, i.e. African Americans, and on society in the United States. 2. Recommend appropriate ways to educate the California public of the task force findings. Number 3. Recommend appropriate remedies in consideration of the task force findings on the matters described in this section and making recommendations the task force shall redress, among other issues, of the following. A. How the recommendations comport with international standards of remedy for wrongs and injuries caused by the state. That include full reparations and special measures as understood by various relevant international protocols, laws, and findings. B. How the state of California will offer a formal apology on behalf of the people of California for the perpetration of gross humane rights violations and crimes against humanity on African slaves and their descendants. C. How California laws and policies that continue to disproportionately and negatively affect African Americans as a group and perpetuate the lingering material and psychological effects of slavery can be eliminated. D. How the injuries resulting from matters described in this subdivision can be reversed, and how to provide appropriate policies, programs, projects, and recommendations for the purpose of reversing the injuries. E. How, in consideration of the task force findings, any form of compensation to African Americans with a special consideration for African Americans who are descendants of persons enslaved in the United States is calculated. F. What form of compensation should be awarded, through what instrumentalities, and who should be eligible for compensation. G. How, in consideration of the task force findings, any other forms of rehabilitation or restitution to African descendants are warranted, and what form and scope of those measures should take. C. The task force shall submit a written report of its findings and recommendations to the legislature no later than the date that is 1 year after the date of the first meeting of the task force held pursuant to section 8301.2 of this chapter. The report shall be submitted in compliance with section 9795. Article 3. Membership. 8301.2. The task force shall consist of 9 members appointed as follows. 5 members shall be appointed by the governor. 2 members shall be appointed by the president pro tempore of the Senate, and 2 members shall be appointed by the Speaker of the Assembly. The governor appointee shall include the following: 1 appointee from the field of academia that has expertise in civil rights. 2 appointees from major social society, and reparations organizations that have historically championed the cause of reparatory justice. C. Not more than 4 appointees shall be members of the legislature. Members shall be drawn from diverse backgrounds to represent the interests of communities of colors throughout the state, have experience working to implement racial justice reform, and to the extent possible represent geographically diverse areas of the state. E. The term of office for members shall be the life of the task force. A vacancy in the task force shall not affect the powers of the task force and shall be filled in the same manner that the original appointment was made. The governor shall call the first meeting of the task force to occur no later than June 1st, 2021. 5 members of the task force shall constitute a quorum. The task force shall elect a chair and vice chair from among its members. The term of office of each shall be for the life of the task force. I. The attendance at meetings during adjournment of the legislature. A legislative member of the task force shall be entitled to per diem compensation and reimbursement of expenses not more than 10 meetings upon appropriation of the legislature. J. Non-legislative members of the task force shall be entitled to per diem compensation and reimbursement of expenses not more than 10 meetings upon appropriation of the legislator. Article 4, Powers, 8301.3. A. For the purposes of carrying out the provisions of this chapter, the task force may do all of the following. Number 1, hold hearings and sit and act at any time and location in California. Number 2, request the attendance and testimony of witnesses. Number 3, request the production of books, records, correspondence, memoranda, papers, and documents. Number 4, seek an order from the Superior Court compelling testimony to compliance with a subpoena. B, any subcommittee or a member of the task force may, if authorized by the task force, take any action that the task force is authorized to take pursuant to this section. C, the task force may acquire directly from the head of the state agency available information that the task force considers useful in the discharge of its duty. All state agencies shall cooperate with the state force in respect to such information and shall furnish all information requested by the state force to the extent permitted by the law. The task force shall keep confidential any information received from a state agency that is confidential or exempt from the California Public Records Act, Chapter 3.5, commencing with Section 6250 of Division 7 of Title 1. Article 5. Administrative provisions may be let into The task force shall have the administrative, technical, and legal assistance of the Department of Justice. C. The task force may procure supplies, services, and property by contract in accordance with the applicable laws and rules. The task force may enter into contracts for the purpose of conducting research, surveys, preparing reports, performing other activities necessary for the discharge of the duties of the task force with state departments, agencies, and other instrumentalities, federal departments, agencies, and other instrumentalities and private entities. Article 6, Reparations, 8301.5. Any state-level reparation actions that are undertaken as a result of this chapter are not a replacement for any reparations enacted at the state federal level and shall not be interpreted as such. Article 7, Termination, 8301.7. This chapter shall remain in effect until July 1st, 2003, and as of that date is repealed. I have just finished reading for you the California Legislative Council Digest, Chapter 319, Assembly Bill number 3121. It is an act to add and repeal Chapter 4.1, commencing with Section 8301, Division 1 of Title 2 of the Government Code related to state government. And I read the other part at the beginning. So what we'll do now is we will go into the actual amendment, and it is entailing a long chapter. So be patient with me. Um, I'm going to try to do this, like I said, during the quarter of the year. I will bring to you the information. This is entitled The California Task Force to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans Final Report. California Task Force to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans. The California Reparations Report. California Reparations Task Force members. Their names are listed here, but I'm going to pass. Table of Contents. Executive Summary is the beginning. Part 1, Recounting Historical Atrocities. Part 2, Enslavement. Part 3, Racial Terror. Part 4, Political Disenfranchisement. Part 5, Housing Segregation. Part 6, Separate and Unequal Education. Chapter 7, Racism in Environmental and Infrastructure. Part 8, Pathologizing the African American Family. Chapter 9, Control over Creative, Cultural, and Intellectual Life. Chapter 10, Stolen Labor and Hindered Opportunity. Chapter 11, An Unjust Legal System. Chapter 12, Mental and Physical Harm and Neglect. Chapter 13, The Wealth Gap. Part 2, International Principles of Reparation and Examples of Reparative Reports. Chapter 14, International Reparations Framework. Chapter 15, Examples of Other Reparatory Reports. Part 3, Recommendation for a Formal Apology. Chapter 16, Methodologies for Calculating Compensation and Restitution. Chapter 17, Final Recommendations. Part 5, Policy Recommendations. Chapter 18, Introduction to the Task Force Policy Recommendations. Chapter 19, Policies Addressing Enslavement. Chapter 20, Policies Addressing Racial Terror. Chapter 21, Policies Addressing Political Disenfranchisement. Chapter 22, Policies Addressing Housing Segregation and Unjust Property Taking. Chapter 23, Policies Addressing Separate and Unequal Education. Chapter 24, Policies Addressing Racism and Environment and Infrastructure. Chapter 25, Policies Pathologizing the African American Family. Chapter 26, Policies Addressing Control over Creative, Culture, and Intellectual Life. Chapter 27, Policies Addressing Stolen Labor and Hindered Opportunity. Chapter 28, Policies Addressing the Unjust Legal System. Chapter 29, Policies Addressing Mental and Physical Harm and Neglect. Chapter 30, Policies Addressing the Wealth Gap. Part 5, Measuring Baseline for Racial Justice Act Implementation. Chapter 31, California Prosecutorial and Judicial Race Data Survey. Chapter 7, Listening to the Community, Harm and Repair, Community Engagement Project Report on Reparations in California. Chapter 8, Recommendations, Part 8, Recommendations for Educating the Public and Responses to Questions. Part 9, Key Cases and Statutes. Chapter 34, Introduction to Compendium of Statutes and Case Law. Chapter 35, Housing and Federal Statutes and Case Law. Chapter 36, Labor and Federal Statutes and Case Law. Chapter 37, Education, Federal Statutes and Case Law. Chapter 38, Political Participation, Federal Statutes and Case Law. Chapter 39, Unjust Legal System Statutes and Case Law. Chapter 40, Federal Civil Rights Cases. And that is the chapters that this particular reparatory report contains. The executive summary is next. The executive summary. Introduction and background.